France, autumn 1917, near the Butte de Vorkwaithe. Earth here did not feel like earth at all. It had the softness of rotted velvet, soaked in rain and marrow and months of blood. Pierre Limiter stepped down into the trench as one might step into a coffin, the mud swallowing his boots with a sick sound that echoed more than it should have. Overhead, a pale sky churned behind torn clouds, and the wind tasted of rust and lye. They told him this scepter had been quiet for weeks, but the quiet felt wrong, as if something was holding its breath beneath the ground. Pierre had only been at the front for 2 days. Before that, he'd been a schoolteacher in Avignon, reading Virgil and teaching boys how to parse ancient languages. Now, he was just another private in the 147th Infantry Regiment, soaked to the skin, carrying a rusting Lebel rifle and trying not to look at the older men's eyes for too long. Their stares were hollow things, hungry and slow. They hardly spoke. They chewed with slack mouths, stared at nothing, and jumped at everything. Even in sleep, they trembled. The trench wound through the blighted woods like a scar, deeper in some places, almost caved in elsewhere. Pierre was assigned to the listening post near the sap liner, narrow dugout that ran forward toward no man's land. The corporal who handed him a lantern had said little, only muttered, "Watch for the shifting." Then he was gone. He didn't know what that meant, but he heard it again later, whispered by a Scottish sniper with a stammer and a 1,000-yard stare. "The shifting," the man said, chewing the edge of his glove. "It doesn't start all at once. Sometimes the trench is longer than you left it. Sometimes it bends where it never did. That's how it starts." Pierre thought it was shell shock. There was a lot of that here. Men went catatonic, chewing dirt and calling for mothers long dead. He tried not to think of his brother. The night came quickly, as if the sun had been snuffed out rather than set. Shadows thickened fast in the trench, and Pierre found himself lighting the dull oil lamp as he crawled toward his post, the flickering flame casting long, quivering shapes on the timbers around him. The post was small, barely big enough for two, carved into the wall near a collapsed crater. The other man stationed there, Julian Moreau, offered only a glance in greeting, his face obscured beneath grime and a hood drawn low. Pierre tried to make conversation, asked where he was from, asked how long he'd been posted. Julian said nothing. He simply turned his head very slowly, like a man underwater, and blinked once. Then, with a voice as dry as bone, he said, "You'll hear it tonight." Pierre thought he meant artillery, but there was no artillery, only silence, and a kind of listening silence at that dot around midnight. The fog began to creep in, not from the sky, but from the floor of the trench, low and cold and wrong. It poured in from the corners like smoke from a dying fire, and Pierre saw that Julian had turned his face away, as though afraid to meet his eyes. And then came the smell, not gas, not rot, something older, something deep, like wet stone or the inside of a crypt. Pierre reached out to nudge Julian, but the man was stiff, unblinking, his pupils wide as moons. When he touched his arm, it was like touching a post. Julian whispered something then, but it wasn't in French. It wasn't in any language Pierre knew. A slow, rhythmic chant, barely audible, like the mutterings of a sleeper on the edge of some terrible dream. That's when Pierre noticed it, a small, barely visible door in the far trench wall. He was certain it hadn't been there when he arrived. It wasn't even made of wood, just a square section of earth, darker than the rest, pulsing slightly as if breathing. No handle, no markings, just a subtle fold in the mud, like a curtain. He turned to ask Julian if he saw it too, but Julian was gone. Not in the way a man slips away he was, simply no longer there. One moment sitting beside him, and the next. Absence, no footprints, no sound of movement, only that strange door and the wet, echoing drip of condensation from the timbers overhead. Pierre's breath fogged the lamp glass as he leaned forward. He should have run, should have raised the alarm. But something about the door held him its shape too symmetrical, too perfect in the mess of broken timber and collapsed sandbags. He touched the wall beside it, and the mud there was warm, like skin. He backed away slowly, heart hammering like a fist inside his ribs. Behind him, from the darkness of the trench, came a noise like whispering, but in the wrong direction. Whispering that didn't carry on the wind, but crept up from below, from beneath his feet. Pierre froze. He had heard something. It was faint, muffled by earth and soaked fabric. But it was there, a voice, and it said his name. France, 1917, the Butte de Vauquois. Fog-bound, trench-line B dawn. Pierre no longer trusted the trench. He hadn't slept. He'd sat there for hours with the lamp guttering beside him, eyes fixed on the place where Julian had been on, the patch of damp wood where his shadow no longer fell. Every minute dragged like a boot through clay. When relief came, no one mentioned Julian. No one looked for him. No one even seemed to remember he'd been there. Pierre asked the corporal, Julian Moreau, tall, quiet, posted to the sapling. The corporal frowned, wiped his nose, and shook his head. Don't know the name. You must have been alone. Pierre said nothing more. But he was not alone. Something had begun to follow him. It wasn't a presence in the normal sense. It didn't walk behind him or call his name aloud in the night knot anymore. Instead, it clung to him, thin as smoke, thick as guilt. When he turned corners in the trench, he sometimes felt the path ahead ripple as if something had just slipped out of view. When he blinked too long, his ears filled with whispers in his own voice. The letters from home, the prayers of the dying, but wrong, slurred, reversed, repeated. The others were different around him now, not hostile but wary. Their eyes lingered too long. Some no longer returned his nods. The Scotsman muttered the Lord's Prayer whenever Pierre passed. One night, a rat crawled into his boot and bit through his sock, but he didn't wake. He only knew when he looked down the next morning and found his foot wet with blood and the boot full of teeth. It was the dreams, though, that truly broke him. The first came 3 days after the door. He was lying in the dugout, the flickering candle casting long, claw-like shadows across the beams. In the dream, he awoke to find he was still in the dugout, but there were no sounds, no drip of water, no muffled gunfire in the distance, no wind, only breath, not his own, deep, slow, wet breaths rising up from the walls, from the mud, from beneath the bunk, the kind of breath that fogs glass from the wrong side. He sat up, looked down. There was something under the bunk, not a man, not an animal, just a shape, curled, wrong, folded like broken limbs in a sack, and it was humming. The same sound Julian had whispered, the same cadence Pierre had heard in the trench. But now, clearer, like chanting, he woke gasping, soaked in sweat. With a mouthful of grit, he checked under the bunk. Nothing but the mud was warm. He tried to tell someone's Sergeant Michel, a broad-shouldered farmer from Reims, who had once laughed like a church bell. But the man only frowned and said, "Some places, the ground remembers. You're just hearing what's already happened." Pierre asked him what that meant. Michel just spat and said, You think this place was built for men. It wasn't. We just found it. Found it. That word stuck with Pierre, like a seed buried behind his ribs. A week passed. Shells returned to the line, distant and listless, like the sky was growling far away. The rain never stopped. Men rotted in their uniforms, boots crumbling, skin pulling. They moved like ghosts, shadows of shadows. Pierre saw a man scrape at the trench wall for an hour straight, muttering, "I hear them in the boards. I hear them in the grain." Another tried to dig down, saying he saw a light. They pulled him out screaming, his nails black and torn. On the 8th day, Pierre found the locket. It was half buried in the mud outside the latrine trench, gleaming faintly despite the grey light. It had initials M. Elland when he opened it. The photograph inside was water damaged, but intact enough to see the face. It was him, not someone like him. Him, the face. The uniform, even the scar above the left brow from where his brother had hit him with a cricket bat when they were boys. But the photo was old, sepia-toned, worn with time. He stared at it for a long time. The inscription behind the photo read, in faint, scratched French, "I came back, but not alone." He threw the locket into the mud and walked away. But the whisper came again that night, beneath the trench, beneath the floorboards, from somewhere deeper than the war. Pierre. He sat bolt upright in the dugout. His boots were at the door, but he had no memory of placing them there. And one of them was wet again, inside, with something thick and black and moving. France, 1917, Valcoy Ridge, sectors 12 to 16. Something was wrong with time. Pierre first noticed it in small ways, a missed meal, a dawn that came and passed without a change in light. The way the officers spoke, in past tense, about things that hadn't happened yet. He'd sit for a moment and find an hour gone, or blink and realize his rifle had moved from where he'd left it. Days blurred. Men came and went without names. But the horror was not in the confusion. It was in the certainty beneath it. Something wanted him to forget. They rotated the company to Sector 15. A collapsed part of the trench dug over with salvage lines and half-dug saps. Rumors swirled like crows. Men said it had been buried last winter, that the earth there sank and never quite stopped, that it moved on its own. Pierre was assigned to night patrol. The trench was quieter than usual, quieter than death, and the fog had returned thicker now, with a kind of taste, not gas. Something organic. Pierre breathed through a rag, but the feeling lingered in his throat like a spider, crawling slowly down the inside of his spine. His new companion was a boy named Renard, 18 at most, freckled, pale, with hands that shook when he lit cigarettes. On their third night, Renard asked, "Did you ever feel like the ground knows you're walking on it?" Pierre didn't answer. Renard looked around, then leaned close, whispering like they were children under blankets telling ghost stories. "I saw a man last night, down in the crater, but he was standing too still, like he wasn't breathing. I watched for 5 minutes. He didn't move once." Pierre asked if he reported it. Renard shook his head. "I don't think it was alive." They didn't speak again for hours. But Pierre knew what the boy meant. There were things here that stood too still, that breathed without lungs, that waited without watching. He felt them sometimes, in the vibration of the duckboards beneath his feet, or the way the trench turned slightly more to the left than it had the day before. And the dreams, they were worse now, not just sounds, visions, real feeling moments. He'd find himself in places that weren't on any map, a flooded tunnel lined with bones, a chapel lit by 1,000 candle wicks sunk in mud, a crater with stairs that led straight down into black. Always the chanting, never words he could understand, just rhythm, meaning beyond sound, like something old and hungry humming to itself. Then came the rats. They stopped running, stopped eating. They just watched, dozens of them, lining the trench walls, unmoving. Their eyes followed, peer in unison, never blinking, never shifting. One sat on his pack for an entire morning and would not be shaken loose. He tried to shoot it. The bullet jammed. The next night, Renard was gone. They found his kit, his rifle, his helmet, everything but him. His boots sat neatly side by side by the crater lip. Inside one boot, a thin scrap of paper, soaked and nearly destroyed. Pierre was the one who opened it. Just 2 words, scrawled in mud. It whispers, they wrote it off. Desertion, they said. Maybe shell shock. Maybe he wandered into no man's land. But Pierre knew better. He hadn't heard Renard scream, and no one simply disappeared with that much calm. No drag marks, no blood, just stillness. And boots, always the boots. Pierre began to see faces in the wood, not metaphorically actually, when he stared too long at the trench walls or the sandbags, knots and where patterns would shift. Faces pressed out from beneath the grain, mouths wide, eyes closed, screaming faces, silent and damp with age. They faded when others came near, but when he was alone, they bloomed like rot. He stopped sleeping, couldn't risk it. When he tried, he heard voices inside his skull, voices that didn't echo, voices that were not in his language but carried the rhythm of grief, like funeral prayers spoken backward, and always the same image before he awoke. Hand reaching up from the mud, his brother's hand, grasping, clawing, and somewhere deep behind that hand, deeper than memory or trench or death itself, something old, something with no shape, no name, a consciousness made of earth and oil and sorrow. Staring up through every buried bone, he began to forget the war, the gunfire, the orders, the enemy. They all became backdrop. Irrelevant. The true threat wasn't German steel or mustard gas. It was below. It had been here before the trenches, before the maps, maybe even before the Romans. It waited, patient as bedrock, until men dug too deep and spilled blood too long. Now it stirred, now it fed, and it had touched Pierre. He could feel it inside him. Now and then a tremor behind the eyes, a cold rush through the bones, a knowledge, not learned but inherited, like it had slipped into his veins in the night and settled there. He stared at his reflection in a puddle that evening. His eyes did not blink when he told them to. His mouth did not smile when he tried. And just for a moment, just one heart-stopping moment, his reflection whispered something he didn't say, and it smiled. France, 1917. The forgotten sapeur no longer walked. He drifted. Every step felt detached, like the ground beneath him had grown thinner, less solid, less true. When he looked down at his boots, he half expected to see them sinking through the mud into something darker than soil. The whispers no longer waited for sleep. They followed him, now, through waking hours, just behind his thoughts. Not loud, never loud, just present, breathing. Then came the night the rain stopped. It hadn't ceased in weeks, but that night it halted all at once, not gradually, not naturally, No mist, no drizzle. One moment, water. The next, silence. Too quiet, like the land itself was listening. The smell changed, too. Gone was the stink of sweat, rust, and rot. It was replaced by something dry, cracked stone, old dust, like the inside of a tomb opened too suddenly. That was the night they found the sapline. A German shell had hit the western lip of the trench and collapsed a wall. Pierre was part of the crew sent to dig it out. He didn't want to. Every bone in him recoiled. But the captain barked orders, and the others stared. And so he obeyed. The collapse revealed a passage, but not one they recognized. It wasn't on any map, no signs, no support timbers, just a raw corridor, burrowed at an angle, descending into the earth like a wound tunneling toward bone. The soil inside was dry, too dry, not a drop of mud, though the ground all around was soaked. No one wanted to enter, but one man did. Sergeant Michel, the one who had spoken of the earth, remembering, he stepped forward with a torch and vanished into the dark. No words, just a nod. Like he knew it had to be him. They waited 10 minutes, 20. No sound, no light. Then the screaming began. It didn't sound like Michel. It didn't sound like any man. It was higher, wider, like it echoed outward, not inward. A howl that came from the marrow of the ground itself. The men fled, all but Pierre, who stood paralyzed by the sound, a sound not meant for human ears. He tried to call out, tried to follow, but something pushed back, not a force, not air dot. A presence. It stood at the mouth of the sapline, like a curtain of breath, invisible but felt. Pierre's lungs seized. His thoughts spun, and then he saw them eyes in the dark, not glowing, but absorbing light, pulling it in, swallowing it, until even the torchlight died with a quiet hiss. The others closed the tunnel, buried it, packed it with sandbags and wet earth, but Pierre knew they were too late. Michel didn't come back. That night, no one slept. No one spoke of the sapline. No report was filed. Orders came down from the officers. It was a sinkhole, nothing more. But Pierre saw them digging again in the night. Quietly, 3 men with shovels. Not soldiers he recognized. And when he tried to speak to them, he blinked, and they were gone. The next day, a mist rolled in from the west, low and grey, but it didn't obey the wind. It moved against it, curling through the trench like smoke with purpose. One of the sentries began coughing, then screaming, clawing at his ears. "It's inside the fog," he shouted, the chanting. They took him away. But Pierre could still hear it long after the man was gone, that night. He returned to the collapsed sapline. He didn't know why. Compulsion, maybe, or something worse. A kind of invitation. The mound of earth was no longer sealed. Someone, or something, had opened it from within. And on the ground beside the opening sat something impossible. Julian's helmet. The man who had vanished the first night Pierre stood watch. The man no one remembered. Inside the helmet, a scrap of cloth. French tricolour, faded and torn, but unmistakable. And burned into it, as if branded by heat, was a single symbol, a spiral of thorns, not written, pressed, as if the cloth had been held to, long against fleshless fingers. Pierre touched it, and suddenly, he was elsewhere, not in body, but in sight, in sound. His ears filled with wet groaning, his mouth tasted of soot. Around him, the sound of digging, of breathless men clawing at the soil, not to escape, but to reach something. He saw them half naked, blindfolded, covered in mud, shoveling. Deeper, ever deeper, towards something that pulsed below. Then a face, not a human one, just the idea of a face, made of roots and ruin and silence, rising through the soil like a memory of a god that had been buried out of fear. Not reverence, it looked at him and smiled. He came back with a scream, lodged in his throat and bile in his mouth. The sapline was sealed again, but the helmet was gone. The fog rolled in thicker the next morning, and the trench was longer, only by a few meters. But Pierre was sure it had grown. France, 1917, beneath the trench line, near Vauquois crater by now. Pierre no longer trusted the ground. He walked as one condemned, softly, with each step calculated, not out of caution, but reverence, because something beneath him listened. He could feel it in the marrow of his feet, in the flecks of the duckboards as they creaked like tired bones. The trench was not a trench anymore. It was a mouth, and they were living inside it. 2 more men vanished. No gunfire, no search, no evidence they had ever existed, save for the impression of where they'd slept indentations in the blankets. Still warm, no one said their names aloud. Pierre suspected the others had already forgotten them, or been made to forget. It was the fog's doing. That living mist, heavy as guilt, light as ash. It crept into men's lungs and took memory with it. It softened thought. It dulled the sound of screaming. But Pierre remembered. Somehow he always remembered. That made him dangerous. And so the dreams grew bolder. He no longer dreamed of the hand clawing through the mud. Now, in his sleep, he was the hand. He saw through its eyes if it had eyes. He dragged himself through tunnels slick with lichen and bone, through passageways not carved but grown, winding through layers of the earth untouched since the world was young. There were markings, symbols not of war, but of worship, and there were voices chanting, humming, not in prayer, but in hunger. One night, Pierre awoke to find himself standing at the edge of the crater again. But this time, he wasn't alone. Across from him, in the mist, a figure stood motionless. A man, or what had been a man, uniform in tatters, face pale as parchment, and those eyes black, not with shadow, but with depth, like looking into a bottomless well. It raised a hand, bent at the elbow like a puppet on string. Pierre stepped back, rifle shaking. The thing smiled. Its teeth were wrong. Too many, too even dot. And then it spoke softly, like a lullaby whispered through teeth. You dug too deep. We were already here. Pierre fired, but the sound was wrong, muted, as if the bullet had passed through water. The figure did not flinch. It only stepped backward, and faded into the fog as if swallowed. From that night on, Pierre could feel them watching. From the walls, from the soil, from the air itself. Men around him grew ill black circles under their eyes, shaking hands, empty smiles. One man sliced off his own ears, said he wouldn't let them back in. They found him curled beneath the latrine, humming a tune no one could place. Pierre tried to leave the trench. He walked until his legs ached, until the sky changed, until he reached the rear position, past the command tents and broken supply lines. Only he didn't. He walked in circles. The trench had folded, bent itself like a maze, rearranged its path behind him, turning known corners into unknown depths. The war above meant nothing now. The line had no front, no back, only a center, and something was pulling everything toward it that night. Someone returned, not Julian, not Renard, Michel, the sergeant, the one who had gone down the sapline. He was waiting in Pierre's dugout, though the flap was closed and latched from the inside. His body was bloated with earth, pale and slick, like something dug up too soon. He didn't speak, not with words. But Pierre felt the thoughts pour in, heavy and slow, like water into lungs. You saw it, you were marked, you must go below. Pierre backed away, but Michel raised his arm, and in his hand, clutched tight, was the tricolour cloth. The one with the spiral. It was damp now, fresh, still bleeding at the edges. Not ink, not paint. Blood. Pierre refused, shook his head, screamed. But Michel only stared, then opened his mouth, and from his throat, not breath, not words, dashed soil, black, grainy, living earth spilled from his mouth like a tide. Worms wriggled in it, bone fragments, teeth. The dugout filled with the stench of burial, but Pierre ran through the trench, past the mess line, past men who didn't look up, past the boy who had no eyes anymore but still wept, past the officer who sat mumbling prayers into his tea. The trench had no end now. It folded over itself, deeper and deeper, until finally the door, not a real door, not wood, not built, but there, that same dark square in the wall, pulsing faintly, breathing. It had grown larger, no longer subtle, now an opening, and behind it a stair, stone slick, descending. Pierre stood before it, shaking rifle, limp in his arms. He could smell the dust again, the ancient dryness. But there was something else now, warmth. Not the sun, but body heat, as if something below was awake, waiting and near. He should have run, but part of him already knew he had already entered. Long ago, perhaps when he touched the cloth, perhaps before, perhaps the moment he first stepped into the trench. Above him the wind moaned. Below the chanting returned, but now he understood it. Not the words, the meaning. It was a name, and it was his. France, 1917, below the trench. In the spiral. Pierre did not remember stepping into the stairwell. There was no moment of decision, no act of courage or surrender. Just the sound of his boots on stone, wet and uneven, echoing downward in slow, eternal rhythm. The deeper he went, the more the walls changed. Not carved, not braced, not built. They were grown. The stone breathed. It bent toward him. It felt fleshy, porous, like it had once been alive and hadn't quite forgotten how. And the spiral continued down. Always down. The chanting grew clearer the lower he went. Not louder, just closer, as though the sound were not carried through air, but through him. He could feel it behind his teeth, in the meat of his heart. Each syllable throbbed, not in volume but in presence, like the voice was inside his skull and the tongue that spoke it was not his dot above. The trench was gone. Not in memory. He remembered every inch of it, but it no longer mattered. The war had vanished. He couldn't recall what side he fought for, couldn't name the date, couldn't remember what it meant to eat or sleep, or feel warmth without suspicion. The deeper levels were worse. He passed rooms carved in silence. Shapes lay slumped in the corners. Soldiers, perhaps, or what was left of them. Uniforms grown into the walls, helmets full of soil. One corpse had eyes that still moved, watching him with glassy patience as he walked past. Another mouthed something. No sound, only lip movement. Pierre knew what it said. Not dead. In the 5th chamber, he saw the boy, Renard, still 18, still pale, but different now. His mouth hung open, and from it poured a long ribbon of fabric red, white, and blue, but wrong. The colours bled into each other, leaking down his chest. The spiral was carved into his skin, over and over, from brow to throat to wrist. He reached toward Pierre, not with anger, not with fear, but with need. Pierre ran. Through corridor after corridor, the spiral always pulling him deeper. Not a symbol any more, but a path and architecture. And the deeper he followed it, the more the walls began to move. Subtle shifts, breathing, contracting, not alive, but remembering life. Something had lived here once, or still did. In the lowest chamber, Pierre collapsed, not from exhaustion, from knowing. The space was vast, circular, domed. The air was wet but held no echo. All sound was swallowed. Even his own breath vanished into the walls. At the center, a pit, not large, not wide, but deep, black, still, and around it, kneeling, were dozens of soldiers in uniforms from every nation. British, French, German, Italian. Some from before this war. Others, older, Roman, Crusaders, Stone Age, their faces hidden beneath dirt-caked masks, spirals carved into foreheads, and they chanted, not aloud, not in sound, but together. In rhythm their minds joined. Pierre screamed, not in defiance, but because it felt good, because he understood now. There had never been a war. Not really, it was all digging. That's what the bombs were. That's what the trenches were. A great unknowing ritual, a mass sacrifice, a carving of the world from the surface down, each crater a breath, each death, a drumbeat. They were trying to wake it up. It had been buried long ago, before language, before light. Not by man, but by something older, something afraid, entombed in flesh and stone and forgetting. But man, in his hunger, had remembered, through war, through blood, through endless digging, and now it stirred. Pierre fell to his knees. He could feel it in the pit. Not a body, not a god, a will, a consciousness. As wide as the sky, coiled beneath the crust of the world like a heartbeat. It didn't see him, it knew him, knew his memories, his guilt, his loneliness, his brother, his prayers, his fear, and it fed on them like warmth. It did not love, it did not hate, it only hungered, and in that moment Pierre felt it reach up not with a hand, but with permission. It gave him a choice. Open the final passage, or remain forgotten. He reached forward. The spiral beneath his hand pulsed. Warm from above, distant, and thin came the sound of shell fire. War had resumed. The world still turned, but it would not for long, because anyone had opened the final gate, and what slept no longer dreamed, it remembered. France, 1917. After the spiral, Pierre awoke beneath the sky. It was morning, pale, wide, cold. He lay just beyond the lip of the Valcoy crater, half buried in the muck, uniform soaked in brackish water. No sign of the staircase, no sign of the pit, just the distant mechanical rumble of artillery to the north, and the crows, dozens of them, circling above like black leaves torn from a burning tree. No one came for him. No one even noticed he'd been gone. When he staggered back to the trench, the men stared, some with confusion, some with quiet, tight-lipped dread. But no one spoke. Not to him, not about him. It was as if he'd stepped out of a place. They all knew but would not name. He asked for the date. They told him it had been 12 days. No. One believed he had survived in no man's land, but no one argued. Not openly. One man crossed himself, another refused to meet his eyes. Pierre kept to himself after that. He didn't sleep much. He didn't eat. He sat in silence, watching the walls of the trench, listening, not for the guns, not for orders, for the heartbeat, because it was still there, faint, subterranean, not constant, but returning in waves. At night, when the wind died, and the world seemed to pause in breathless mourning, he heard it, thump, thump, slow, rhythmic, patient, and with each pulse he felt something, shifting not just within the trench, within him the dreams didn't stop, only changed. He no longer wandered tunnels, no longer heard whispers. Now he remembered. Images came in fragments, rituals of blood and mud, circles drawn in ash, offerings made not to gods but to memory itself. He saw a face, sometimes, or the idea of a face, massive, eyeless, cracked by time, half buried in earth, not alive, but not dead. Waiting. One morning, a soldier near Pierre began convulsing. No wounds, no gas, just sudden, violent thrashing, and then silence. When they rolled him over, his tongue had been torn out, but not by force, by choice. He had bitten through it. Carved into the side of his boot, barely visible beneath dried mud, was a spiral. The same as Pierre's cloth, the same as the pit, the same as the one that sometimes now formed in frost beside Pierre's bedroll, perfect, delicate, growing dot. Pierre didn't speak much after that. He started to write. Pages and pages of symbols, drawn in charcoal, mud, even blood, spirals, eyes, shapes that hurt to look at. He burned most of them, buried the rest, but they kept coming back, sometimes tucked in his coat pocket, sometimes folded inside a ration tin, once carved into the handle of his bayonet, though he knew he hadn't done it. One night, he woke to find he'd crawled 20 meters down the trench in his sleep, face down, hands raw, eyes open, and his mouth was full of earth. That was the last night he slept. He saw the war end. He heard the whistles, saw the cheering, felt the strange, blank relief that passed through the ranks, like smoke. But he didn't cheer. He didn't feel free, because the war had not ended. Not for him, because the thing beneath the trench, beneath all trenches, was not bound by treaties or time or silence. It had waited through the birth of empires. It would wait through their collapse. Pierre returned to Avignon, or what was left of it. He walked the hills, taught again for a time. But the boys said he stared too long at the soil, that he wept when it rained, that he mumbled to himself when no one was near. He never spoke of the spiral, not until the last letter, addressed to no one, found decades later, buried behind the wall of his home. It read, "We were never meant to go below." Not like that, not all at once. We were not soldiers, we were keys. I hear it still, I think I always will. And if you feel it too, do not dig, not even to bury the dead. The rest of the letter was stained, ink blurred, pages gone, but on the final page, scratched faintly into the paper a spiral, drawn not in ink, but in something black, still soft to the touch,